The logic appears to be that, well, if he's using Latin words, it makes sense he'd be in Rome, where Latin was spoken. It kind of overlooks the fact that Latin was spoken in the entire western half of the empire. And so it doesn't really narrow it down to Rome very well.
Hello, lovely people. My name is Emma. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you are new. Today I am joined by the lovely Dr Bart Ehrman. He is a friend of the channel. I've spoken to him a number of times on different topics. We're talking about Mark today, and I think this is especially interesting because Bart has a different perspective than Dr Tabor, who we also discussed about it recently. I'm big in Mark mode at the moment. I don't know why, and now that I've started reading it more, it's turning up everywhere I look. I see Mark and references to Mark. It's very weird, but I'm really excited to learn more. I hope you enjoyed this interview. I always have a great time talking to Bart. If you do enjoy it, you can check out some of the other discussions we've had. I will check back on you at the end for details of Bart's course, which you will also find down below. All right. Hi, Bart. Good to speak to you again.
Nice to speak to you.
So there's no time to waste today. All right. We're talking about Mark. We got to talk about Mark.
The end is near.
The end is near. Well,
yeah.
And that's interesting because this is quite an apocalyptic text.
Yes, it is.
For some reason, I reread Mark recently, and now I'm seeing it everywhere. I stumbled onto it, a post about it on Conservapedia, which is like a big sort of pro-Trump wiki thing, and they call it the Trumpian gospel, which I thought was quite interesting.
The Trumpian gospel. Wow. Okay.
Because they view it as very straightforward and sort of truth-telling, which I thought was kind of an interesting, an interesting reading.
Mark is not straightforward. It's telling the truth from its perspective, so at least it's not lying.
Yeah, which I think is interesting, being likened to Trump as well. But I'll steer us away from politics. Okay, so right, where does this gospel come from? Is it possible that any of the information in Mark is first-hand testimony, or is it just second, third-hand, completely invented?
Well, I don't think it's completely invented. I also don't think it's anything like an eyewitness report. So historical scholars have for a very long time have thought that Mark was probably written around the year 70 of the Common Era. Jesus died around the year 30. And so it's about 40 years later. It's written by somebody who was not from Israel, who did not know Jesus. He's not writing in the same language that Jesus spoke. And so he's writing in Greek, and Jesus spoke in Aramaic. And he never gives any indication that he's an eyewitness or that he's talked to any eyewitnesses. It appears that he's repeating stories that have been in circulation for 30 or 40 years. And that doesn't nullify necessarily what he says, but it does mean that we're not dealing with somebody who sat down the day after Jesus died and wrote it all down. It is not that at all.
And do we have any? Because I've seen some suggestions about where the author of Mark might have been from, where he might have been writing, and I've also seen a lot of people contesting those things. So, what's the vibe?
Well, the common view is that Mark was the secretary of the Apostle Peter, and that he's writing down his account of things in the city of Rome. This is based on the idea that Peter went to Rome, and I guess maybe people think he founded the church in Rome or something, which just isn't true. I mean, in the New Testament, it's quite clear Peter did not found the church in Rome. But the idea is that Mark is in Rome, and people use as one of their arguments for this that in Mark there are a number of Latinisms. In other words, Latin words being used even though he's writing in Greek. And the logic appears to be that, well, if he's using Latin words, it makes sense he'd be in Rome, where Latin was spoken. It kind of overlooks the fact that Latin was spoken in the entire western half of the empire. And so it doesn't really narrow it down to Rome very well. And there are, as I said, these are stories that have been in circulation for a long time among a large number of groups of Christians who are telling stories about Jesus. I mean, they're trying to convert people to believe in Jesus. And the only way to convert somebody to believe in Jesus is to tell you what an amazing person he was and to talk about his death and his resurrection and his miracles and things. And so these stories are being used to convert people. They're also being used to support the belief of believers in various places. And so the fact that the story has some Latinisms in it isn't surprising. And it has some Aramaisms in it too, some use of Aramaic. But it's, yeah. So we don't know. Sure. I could have given you the short answer, which is we don't know where it was written. It's in some place in the empire that has a pretty big population, probably an urban center someplace in the empire.
Okay, that checks out. And so you mentioned how important it is sharing the story of Jesus's doings and life and the resurrection things. Or at least it certainly doesn't seem like Mark actually has the resurrection portion of the story. It also doesn't have a birth narrative. It sort of kicks off sort of mid-flight. He's here, he kicks off with his baptism. I think that's really interesting. To me as a reader, it almost seems like Mark might not believe in a physical resurrection. What do you think? Am I totally off base?
I think you're totally off base.
I appreciate your candor.
Yeah, I think Mark does have a resurrection narrative. What he doesn't have is the appearances of Jesus afterward. Jesus, throughout the gospel, on 3 occasions, he specifically says that he'll be rising from the dead. And then what happens, the way the gospel ends, it's a little bit complicated because it depends which translation of the Bible people are using, if they're reading it in English. Because in the King James Version and in other versions, Jesus, he dies, he is buried, and he's raised from the dead. And then at the end of Mark, in a lot of the older translations, he actually appears to his disciples. But scholars have known since the 19th century that ending of Jesus appearing to the disciples was added on by later scribes. There really isn't much doubt about this, and it's not really a debated issue among historical scholars. But what it means is the way it works and the way it does end in Mark is that Jesus is dead, he's buried, he's put in the tomb, and on the 3rd day in chapter 16, the women go to the tomb in order to give him a more proper burial. But when they get there, the stone is rolled away from the tomb, and they see a young man in there. And the young man says, "You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He's not here. He's been raised from the dead. Go tell Peter and the disciples that he'll meet them in Galilee." And then it says, and the women didn't tell anything to anyone because they were afraid. Period. That's where it ends. And so Jesus is definitely raised from the dead in Mark's gospel. But what's really, really interesting is that there are no accounts of him showing up to the disciples. And I'm going to be talking about this in this course because it's a brilliant ending, and it perfectly illustrates some of Mark's major themes in his gospel otherwise. And scribes, of course, they got to that ending. The women didn't tell anybody. The scribes said, "Ay, what?" Of course they meant to tell you. And so they had an ending where he does.
Which is so what do you think? What's his intention in stopping there at this? Because it almost reads like a tragedy, like that they didn't tell anyone and that's the end.
I know. Well, historically, of course, it doesn't work in terms of history, because then everybody says, "Well, how's Mark know about it then?" And yeah, so historically, it doesn't work. But it's not. This is a story, and as a story, it's fantastic because one of the distinctive features of Mark that I'm going to be talking about a good bit in my lecture that people don't realize. They don't realize Mark's distinctive features because they tend to read Mark as if he's saying the same thing Matthew's saying and same thing Luke is saying and maybe even the same thing John is, and he's not. Mark, alone among these Gospels, stresses that throughout his ministry, nobody could figure out who Jesus was. His family think he's crazy. His mom and his brothers think that he's gone nuts, and his opponents, the Jewish leaders, think he's inspired by the devil. His townspeople think he's the carpenter. How does he know any of this stuff? And the disciples never can get it. That's a major theme of Mark's gospel. The disciples never get it. They start getting it about halfway through. They start figuring out, I guess he's the Messiah, but they don't really understand what it is. And at the end, they still don't get it. The women don't tell them. It's like, whoa, this is perfect for this gospel.
It's kind of awesome, but it's difficult to sort of understand on a first reading. His identity is like a massive question mark sort of throughout Mark. I think you have the sort of, you have God, obviously, and then later a demon, very shortly after, who know who Jesus is. Yeah. But the human characters are just sort of all over the place. And when Jesus asks his disciples about who the people think he is, Peter says, "You're the Christ," and Jesus sternly tells them not to tell anyone. What's going on there?
Well, and like when he casts out these demons, they say, "Oh, you're, we know who you are. You're the holiest one, the Holy One from on high." He says, "Don't tell anyone. Be quiet." He heals somebody. He says, "Don't tell anyone." The disciples see his transfigure and say, "Don't let anybody know." And then, yeah. So Peter almost exactly halfway through the gospel in chapter 8. Confesses that you are the Messiah. And right when Peter says that, Jesus replies that he has to go to Jerusalem and be rejected by the Jewish leaders and killed and executed, and then he'll rise from the dead. And Peter, the one who just said you're the Messiah, says, "No, Lord, not you," because Peter isn't expecting. Peter has the expectation of a Messiah that Jews had, of a Messiah that he's going to be a great political military leader and get rid of the enemy. And Peter and Jesus say, "Yeah, I'm going to get killed by the enemy." And Peter, whoa, wait a second. So Mark's gospel is all about how Jesus can be the Messiah if he got crucified. It's the last thing somebody expects of a Messiah. And Mark's gospel is designed to show how that is. But part of the intrigue of Mark is that Jesus knows it and the reader knows it and nobody else can figure it out.
Yeah. And to that end, I find the crucifixion quite interesting as well. Because, you get different sort of accounts across different gospels. But in Mark, Jesus is crucified and he seems to think that God has forsaken him. What does that mean for Jesus being, divine?
Oh God! Well, yeah, it's a question whether Mark never comes out and calls Jesus God, calls him the Son of God, which the King of Israel was the Son of God, and I think Mark himself actually does think that Jesus was a divine being, but it's not. Jesus never talks about himself being divine. The irony of the crucifixion scene is what you just pointed out, that throughout this gospel, 3 times explicitly and in other places implicitly, Jesus says he has to be executed. It's this is what has to happen. Then when it comes to the moment, he seems in complete doubt. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he asks God not to make him do it. And then on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And it's the only thing he says in Mark's gospel on the cross. He doesn't say all the other things people associate with Jesus saying at the end. That's what he says. And he dies forsaken. So that even Jesus at the end doesn't quite understand. But the key to that is that the reader understands, because right after he says that, he dies. The curtain in the temple is ripped in half. That's the curtain that separates the Holy of Holies where God dwelt from the people. So now there's no separation. There's no barrier between God and humans. And then the next second, the centurion who just crucified him says, "Truly this man was the Son of God." Finally, somebody gets it, that the Son of God has to die, and the centurion is this pagan. He's this Roman who just crucified him. Nobody else gets it, his family or his friends or his disciples. But this is like so good. It is so, people breeze over Mark's gospel because they think it is this nuts and bolts straightforward thing. Oh my God, it is not. You've got to read it deeply, or you just miss the whole thing.
Yeah, it's a weird one, but it's a really fascinating drama. Just briefly, then we touched on this earlier, the sort of additions that scribes made later. They seem to more or less essentially make Mark conform more to the other Gospels. Do you find these additions contradict the story that Mark's trying to tell? Or
in some places they do. So in my course, I'm going to devote an entire lecture to I'm having a lecture on the ending of Mark. I'm going to talk about what really happens at the end, why, and how we know that it didn't have that ending where Jesus appeared, how we know that's not original, but then why did Mark end it that way? But then I'm having a separate lecture with a bunch of other changes scribes made in the text that sometimes make the text say just the opposite of what it originally said. And some of these changes that scribes made that is just the opposite of what Mark originally wrote are found in your translations. And so this is the kind of thing that it's great. It's great to do, and people would have no way of knowing apart from having somebody who studied this stuff tell them. And it's not the sort of thing you're going to hear in church. But you're going to be covering this kind of stuff.
Awesome. Well, I absolutely can't wait. Thank you for giving us a little bit of insight. I'm very excited. Yeah, I can't wait to be confused and proven wrong, and probably more confused than when we started, but
No, you're going to be enlightened. You're not going to be confused. Like, I got to tell you, Mark is, you're not supposed to like any book of the Bible better than another. When you're a Bible, and you're supposed to like your one child more than another. But I'm telling you, Mark's my favorite gospel. It's probably my favorite book of the Bible, the Gospel of Mark. I just think it's so underrated by people. They have no idea how cool it is.
It is actually a really fun one once you get into it.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, it was great to speak to you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I really hope you enjoyed this little interview. If you do want to learn more about the Gospel of Mark, the story of Jesus that it is telling, do check out the course. There will be an affiliate link down below. If you click on that, it also helps this channel out. There will be a live recording of this course on the 18th and 19th of February, so if you purchase the course before then, you can join live and enter into the Q&A. Either way, once you buy this course, you have full lifetime access to the entire 8-part lecture. You get PDF lesson guides, you get FAQs, you get audio versions, you get an additional reading list. By purchasing this course, you also get discounts on Bart's other courses on how scholars read the Bible, which is really, really worth listening to. I've enjoyed all of the ones that I have done so far. Do let me know your thoughts down below. Leave a cheeky little like, subscribe if you haven't already. Before we go, I would like to give a big shout out and a thank you to my giant chickens and colossal quackers over on Patreon. Thank you again for watching this video. I hope you have a very lovely week, and I will see you really soon.